Okay, so we are now live streaming. So it's really such a pleasure to, Andy, you okay?
Yeah, someone just asked if it's being recorded.
Yes, it is being recorded. It's being recorded. It's live streaming to Facebook, which will be a recording that you can find on social media, and we will send the follow-up link in our follow-up email. We'll send the link in our follow-up email tomorrow, so you can also share it with people beyond this evening. So it's really a pleasure to be here. We have been talking about this event for quite a while. It's extra special to be here with Andy Friedman, who's one of the leaders of our Zioness Chicago chapter. And she introduced me to the wonderful Elizabeth Dawes Gay, who it turns out I went to college with. And you all know Rabbi Lindsey Danziger, our fantastic National Organizing Director at Zioness. So, this is a critical conversation. A couple of weeks ago was the 48th anniversary of Roe versus Wade. We know that we are in a tenuous place in terms of reproductive health and reproductive justice in this country. And a lot of people have a lot of questions. Where are we now? How did we get here? And where do we go moving forward? Yes, I have to change my name. Sorry about that. So we are really lucky to be here with Andy Friedman, who is an advocate who works for organizations throughout the country to expand abortion access. Her previous experience includes serving as Director of Reproductive Health at the National Partnership for Women and Families, the Foreign Policy and Defense Legislative Aid to the late Senator Frank Lautenberg in New Jersey, the founding Vice President of the Global Justice Center. She began her career at the Women in Public Policy program at the Kennedy School of Government. She serves on the boards of Personal PAC and the Midwest Access Project. She's a JD from Harvard Law School, where she was a co-founder of the Harvard Law Students for Choice chapter, now called If, When, How, and a BA summa cum laude from Tufts University, where she was the student body president and founder of the Tufts Feminist Alliance. Andy lives in Chicago with her wife and 2 daughters. And Elizabeth Dawes Gay is a social entrepreneur who's passionate about solving social problems that specifically affect women of color. Her life's mission is to create a world where women of color have what they need to achieve their ideal well-being. Elizabeth's lived experience as a Black woman in the United States drives her to fight injustice and create a more equitable world. Elizabeth founded IPADE because women of color deserve a beautiful and functional sanctuary where they can work, learn, strategize, and organize free from racially driven macro and microaggression. She's a co-founder of the Black Mamas Matter Alliance, the founder of CSU Social Justice Consulting, and the founder of a leadership development initiative called Black Women For. Elizabeth is a global citizen based in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. It's amazing to have you guys. And we're gonna start with an opening from Rabbi Lindsey Danziger, this event is in conjunction with the Reproductive Shabbat, Repro Shabbat, which is being put on by the National Council of Jewish Women. There are organizations doing events all over the country this weekend to celebrate Repro Shabbat. So it's really wonderful to have Lindsey here to teach us how Jewish text commits us to reproductive health.
Thank you so much. And I am Rabbi Lindsey Danziger. Like Amanda said, I'm the National Organizing Director here at Zioness. I love getting to work with our chapters in all their many events and all the issues we advocate for. And I'm just completely humbled after hearing the biographies of our 2 panelists and super excited to start learning. So before we start learning with our panelists, we are going to just take a brief look at some Jewish texts to ground ourselves on why we are taking the time to have a reproductive rights Shabbat, why we're partnering in this, why this is a Jewish issue, and to ground us in what the Jewish faith tradition has to say on the topic, because it's really nuanced and it's a lot. And in our country right now, I know in my work and my advocacy, I have often heard this loud religious voice speaking powerfully with an anti-choice agenda. And they use biblical quotes from our very Torah, religious language, and have really taken ownership of this term faith-based values. They present abortion as a sin and a fetus as a human life with rights the same, if not more, than the person who is pregnant. And I think it's important for us to know that as Jews, we also have faith-based values. As non-Jews, we can study the faith texts of other religions and learn what they have to say. And the Jewish tradition has a very different perspective than the one I was just mentioning. And our perspective is rooted in a just really profound respect for life and the belief that every single person has a divine spark within them. So we're going to look at a few texts together really briefly and speed through them, but some important tenets that guide the Jewish view on abortion before I pull up the text are: a pregnant person's life, their pain, and their concerns take precedence over the fetus in Jewish legal tradition. An existing life takes precedence over a potential life legally, and a person who is pregnant has the freedom to apply the principles of their tradition to make their own choices without interference. And those are three really important points. So we're about to dig into some text. I'm going to share my screen, and I just want to give a brief heads up that Jewish legal texts were written by men in ancient times in a very heteronormative and gender binary society. So in my teaching, I'm going to be using words like women and mother because I'm teaching directly from a very ancient text. But in today's society, we know that these issues apply to people of all genders who can become pregnant. So I'm going to share my screen. And if you were on the pre-Zoom, you saw this isn't always my strong suit. I hope it works. So are you seeing some text from Exodus? Yes? Can I get a thumbs up from fellow panelists? I see. Okay, it's working. Perfection. So I will also share that Jews read different parts of our Torah every week. And this weekend on Shabbat, this text that you're looking at right now, this is the text that Jews across the world are all going to be reading together. And that's why our partners at the National Council of Jewish Women chose this week to be Repro Shabbat. So we can use this text right here as a way to answer a question that's probably familiar to us, and a question that's also asked by our U.S. legal tradition. And the question is, does a fetus have rights, and where do they intersect with the rights of the mother? So here in this first text from Exodus, we can read, "He who fatally strikes a man shall be put to death." So, right, that's pretty unambiguous. That's pretty clear. The punishment for taking a life, even sometimes by accident, can be death. So we would think if a fetus were considered to be a life, then it would make sense that the punishment for terminating pregnancy, either on purpose or by accident, could be death. But in our second text, we see that is just not the case. When men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. So I bet many of us have actually heard this text before. I wonder if there are people who didn't know that the term an eye for an eye actually comes from an ancient text about pregnancy loss. But basically, if someone accidentally pushes a pregnant woman and she miscarries but is unharmed, that's one situation and one process for seeking justice. But if he harms the woman herself, there's a whole other process and a whole other standard for justice. So in this first scenario where the woman is unharmed, the perpetrator actually pays the husband for the financial damages equaling the market value of her fetus. But in the second damage, this text, if other damage ensues, that means the woman herself got hurt. This becomes a whole different scenario, a whole different type of crime, and a whole different type of justice. So it's kind of, in my mind, my non-legal mind, akin to a civil lawsuit for damages versus a criminal lawsuit for assault or manslaughter. It's obviously more severe if the woman herself is impacted, and it could even be a capital crime to injure or kill the woman, and it couldn't be to kill a fetus. So from this, Jewish tradition concludes that our Torah teaches that a fetus is actually not a life with the rights of a person. It has value. It's a potential life, but it is not considered a person in our tradition. And this is actually the central Jewish legal text about abortion. So we're going to look at one other question that we can answer with some text. And the question is also one that comes up a lot in debates about this issue. And the question is, when does life begin? So we read in our creation tradition story from the book of Genesis, the Lord God formed man from the dust of the earth. He blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. So in Jewish tradition, it is breath that signifies the beginning and also the end of life. It's not the beating of a heart. So a Hebrew word that's here in this text, nephesh, is the Hebrew word for human. It's the Hebrew word for soul. And it's also the same word for breath. In our tradition, a baby crosses this threshold from a potential life to a full life when it draws its first breath, not beforehand. And this is really important right now in our political climate when we think about things like heartbeat bills that are in states across the country, including my own home state of Ohio. And so the last text we're going to look at together is a later and lesser known text. It's come from the Mishnah, which is a commentary on Torah written by rabbis, but it's also still a binding and important part of Jewish law. So it's a pretty challenging text, actually. And it says, if a woman is about to be executed, they do not wait for her until she gives birth. But if she had already sat on the birth stool, they wait for her until she gives birth. So, it's a hard text, and it teaches that even if a pregnant woman who is sentenced to death is to be executed, you go forward with the execution while pregnant. You're not supposed to wait until she gives birth unless she is actively in labor already. So this is troubling. I wouldn't go and use this text in our criminal justice reform advocacy, but it shows that a fetus is not considered a life, at least until during active labor, much later than some of the laws in our country currently. And I'm just going to conclude by sharing a really interesting piece of commentary on this text. The rabbis, some later rabbis in a commentary called the Talmud, were discussing this ruling, and they made this really emphatic statement, kind of even like out of character for them. And they said about how they viewed the fetus, and they said, Pshita gufahi. Isn't it obvious? It is her body. That's what the rabbis said in ancient times. They were saying the fetus is not a life, it's part of a woman's body. So this thing that was so obvious to 5th century rabbis has become not obvious to a lot of contemporary lawmakers and people in our society today. The fact that people who become pregnant deserve the right to bodily autonomy was an obvious part of Jewish legal tradition. So I just want to leave you with those words and that message as we transition to our panel tonight. So the next time you hear this narrative that being a person of faith means that you support taking away pregnant people's right to choose, you will know that's a lie. So I hope you can go forward in your advocacy armed with those words from 5th century, really traditional male rabbis. Pshita gufahi. Isn't it obvious? It is her body. So that's just a little bit of our faith tradition and why we are called to work on this issue. And I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back to Amanda and our panelists.
Thank you, Lindsey. That was amazing. Really so interesting. I had not seen that presentation before, so I feel really enlightened, and I hope that everyone watching does too. And I'm really so excited to begin this conversation. I'm going to play a quick video, and I may also have share screen issues, so hope this goes smoothly. We're just going to watch about 3 minutes of something.
Amanda, is this the video that I had flagged for you?
Yeah.
Okay, I was gonna do a little introing of it later, but we can start with it.
Oh, I thought you wanted me to start with it. Okay, so let's start with the first question. I thought you wanted me to start with this to introduce the first question. So the first question, which is going to be for both Andy and Elizabeth, is really just how you would describe the state of reproductive freedom in this country, given that we're early in a new administration, just ending an administration that was actively committed to undermining the rights of people who can get pregnant. And given the composition of the Supreme Court right now, I know a lot of people have a lot of questions about what the future of abortion access and reproductive freedom look like. Andy, as an attorney specifically, I know that you have a lot of thoughts. And of course, Elizabeth, as a Black woman who's doing this work specifically in the intersection of racial justice and reproductive justice, I know you'll have a unique perspective as well. So whoever wants, Andy, take it first.
Okay, I can start first with just this slice around abortion, and then Elizabeth would love for you to take us back to the bigger picture, because there's a lot more going on, to be sure, than this piece on abortion. So, you know, I'd say things are, despite the new administration, things are not great. I don't want to, sugarcoat it, right? That things are likely to get worse before they get better. But I will try to hold on to I think that there are reasons to be hopeful. I think things we saw in this past election, and also things that have been happening for a long time, and work that's happening that we are, maybe just starting to recognize and see. So for sure, if the presidential had gone the other way, it would have been devastating, unimaginably devastating consequences, obviously for a lot more reasons than just abortion access, the state of our democracy being one. So while we do have a reprieve, at the same time, access to all reproductive health, abortion included, happens in communities, right? It happens at the state level. And the situation in many states, politically speaking, got worse. And it was already pretty bad when it came to abortion access. We already had hundreds of restrictions in place, more of which I'll talk about more. And of course, the Supreme Court, the loss of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a true champion, to be replaced by someone like Amy Coney Barrett, whose beliefs are so problematic, who had signed on to an ad that by an organization that believes in criminalizing people for having abortions and criminalizing people for having IVF, right? I mean, just truly a different worldview, and per your point, Lindsay, taking faith and turning it into a way to take away other people's rights. But before I dig into that landscape too much, I wanted to share this video that Amanda was referencing a minute ago, which is very brief. It's by the National Network of Abortion Funds, which is a phenomenal organization that helps connect people to resources to get access to abortion. As you'll learn in the video, the majority of people who have abortions are low income, and accessing an abortion can be extremely challenging because of the many barriers in place. So I just wanted to show the first little part of this because I think it's just so beautiful and does a much better job, and we'd all rather listen to Padma than to me. And then I can provide more context as we dig in further. So why don't you want to play the three videos?
Yes.
3 minutes.
You can see the share screen, right? You can see it? Okay.
Abortion is legal in all 50 states, and access to abortion is supported by the majority of Americans. But that doesn't mean everyone who needs an abortion can get one. Access to reproductive health care, including abortion, largely depends on where you live and how much money you have. Anti-abortion advocates have been working to restrict abortion since the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision in 1973, which made abortion legal nationwide. Passed by Congress each year, the Hyde Amendment bans federal funding of abortion. This policy impacts millions of people in the U.S. and overly affects people with low incomes and communities of color. The Hyde Amendment forces many people with public health insurance to stay pregnant when they do not want to. Although most people in the U.S. support reproductive rights, anti-abortion lawmakers have made getting an abortion very difficult. In some places, a person seeking an abortion might be forced to travel several states away, experience delays, such as government-mandated waiting periods, unnecessary extra clinic visits, and go through more difficult procedures for care. Procedures that could have been easily and safely provided close to their home and their community. A person traveling for an abortion may need to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars for airfare and hotels, meals away from home, car rental or bus tickets, and childcare, often while having to miss shifts at work because they don't have paid leave. In order to afford an abortion, a person may need to take on extra work, sell their belongings, forego buying groceries, or make other sacrifices of basic needs. Someone you love may have to choose between groceries and rent or health care. On top of the political, financial, and physical barriers to getting an abortion, there is a social and cultural barrier that affects many of us. Abortion stigma is so common that a person choosing to end a pregnancy may feel very alone when making their decision because the media inaccurately portrays abortion, from TV shows, movies, and music to the many false or misleading stories about abortion in the news. Family, friends, co-workers, and intimate partners may also talk negatively about abortion in ways that can further isolate a person who's making a decision about their health care. This leads to people being afraid to tell their loved ones that they want an abortion and need support. The truth is, abortion is very common. In order for abortion to be truly an option, it must not only be legal, but actually available without the shame. It's time we work together towards a world where all people have the power and resources to care for and support their bodies, identities, and health for themselves and their families. We need to take the hassle, hustle, and harassment out of healthcare. It's time to change the conversation about abortion to make it a real option available to all people without shame or judgment. We all love someone who has had an abortion, whether we know it or not. All of our lives are affected by abortion access.
Great. Thank you, Amanda, for sharing that screen for me. And I hope you all enjoyed that video. I'll put you can see the whole thing in the chat. But just to, wrap up this piece of it quickly and pass it over to Elizabeth, I want to say that, access to abortion, and when you look at, briefly talking about a study that was recently done called the Turnaway Study that showed that people who are unable to access, it was a huge longitudinal study. They watched people over years who were able to access abortions and who weren't. In this case, it was women, and found a much greater rate of, if the woman was not able to access the abortion care, 4 times greater risk of household poverty, 3 times greater risk of unemployment, increase in public assistance. The lives became less secure, more likely to be in an abusive situation. And while this reflects the importance of being able to control our own lives and determine whether or not we access abortion care, it's really important to also think about this as part of a larger failure of our systems, right? That we don't provide the resources for people who are pregnant, who want to stay pregnant, to be able to have healthy pregnancies, and the underlying discrimination against people who are low income, discrimination against people who are Black or people of color who aren't able to access the same healthcare and resources, and the systemic racism that has led to the disparities that we're seeing in our country. So I think it's important to situate this access to abortion as part of a much larger problem in our country. And so I'm really thrilled that Elizabeth is here to also talk about the work on maternal mortality that she has been doing, and help us have a broader perspective on that. So I will leave the abortion piece for now and we can come back to it.
Thank you and good evening, everyone. I just want to preface by saying I am a co-founder of Black Mamas Matter Alliance, so I'm not in leadership and I do not speak on behalf of them. I stepped away in 2019 to focus on some other things. So I just wanted that to be clear. That said, I think, everyone's correct. This is a really challenging time that we're living in right now. And that's become increasingly apparent. Folks have greater awareness around systemic oppression, white supremacy, and how it shows up in a variety of ways and it impacts people's lives. But I also am holding on to this thread of hope because I work with a lot of organizations that are on the ground in communities, making a difference, serving people, meeting the needs of pregnant people, pushing forth legislation at the local level, organizing, and also making a difference at the federal level. So for example, this week even, the Black Maternal Health Momnibus Act was reintroduced. So we've got a Momnibus Act of 2021. And that's really exciting because it's a suite of legislation that covers things from, pregnancy care for veterans, to addressing social determinants of health, to thinking about Medicaid reimbursement, and mental health, and all the things that go into ensuring that people have healthy pregnancies and a healthy first few years postpartum. So, I'm very hopeful. There are some great things moving, and Vice President Harris, also when she was Senator Harris, introduced legislation on maternal health. And so I think we have, we're very fortunate to have an administration that understands reproductive justice, that's had opportunities to sit down with advocates that, even I brought to the Hill, to talk to staffers and that kind of thing, that to increase their understanding of the nature of reproductive health rights and justice, and that it's not just about healthcare, but it's about how folks are treated in our country overall. It's about economic justice, racial justice, politics, and power. But I'm also very hopeful.
Sorry, I was muted. I'm gonna just put it to speaker mode, so whenever anyone's speaking, they go on the screen. I want to stick with you, Elizabeth, and ask you specifically if you can help sort of paint the picture for how the challenges that Andy mentioned, and obviously that you're very familiar with, affect women of color, especially Black women, differently. And if you can give, for people who aren't familiar, and I was not always familiar with the really staggering statistics in terms of Black maternal mortality, and how that fits into the larger issue of systemic racism and health inequity and inequality. I feel like you can paint that picture for us in a way that can really help people understand how much work there is to do on this issue.
Definitely. So for folks who don't know, Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely across the US to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. And in some places that disparity is more, that difference is greater. There was a report out of New York a few years back showing that Black women were 12 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes. And so beyond maternal mortality, because death is the extreme, and fortunately, most people, survive pregnancy and childbirth. And so we can be grateful for that. But maternal morbidity, which is things like hemorrhage or needing age blood transfusion, or preeclampsia, different, organ failure. There are different things that happen during pregnancy and postpartum that also affect Black women disproportionately. So I mentioned that to say that there are, disparities in that regard as well. And one of the things as an advocate, I've tried to do over the past few years is to raise awareness of that this is happening, that there is this difference, and to help folks understand why that is. And when you look at the data, it really becomes apparent that underlying a lot of this are what we can point to and boil down to as racism and discrimination, not only within the healthcare system, with how people are treated, but in society overall. There are barriers that women of color have to accessing care, to accessing timely care. There are quality issues, when you are accessing care. There's questions around and anecdotes and evidence that show, women, for example, who have Medicaid are treated differently. There are very real concerns that people have around being ignored by healthcare providers, not having questions answered, being mistreated. And so again, there's a healthcare component when you actually are able to access, do you get the care that you actually need? And I think for many women of color, more so than white women, the answer is no, right? And so people are I think becoming more cognizant of that and turning to community-based service providers or more holistic care providers. But as far as systems go, there's definitely an economic concern. Women of color, especially Black women in the United States, are more likely to lack wealth. I don't know what the exact numbers are right now, but a few years ago, it was like Center for American Progress that put out this report showing that the average wealth for Black women was like $5, like the average savings. And I think what is harder to see is poverty and the way that intersects with race, right? We don't always see poverty and how it shows up, but a lot of people are affected by that. So I think that's one thing. We can think about one of the examples that I had used in a previous presentation was thinking about a woman's ability to access care and all the things that have to happen for that to be successful, like transportation, like childcare, time off from work, again, money, a healthcare insurance card. So there are any number of places where a breakdown could happen that make life difficult and stressful. And a lot of research, some really fantastic researchers have identified stress as something that really impacts health, especially during pregnancy. So there is a physiological component to all of this. It's not just money and access, right? There is that lack of money, that lack of resource, the lack of care and attention takes a toll. Navigating the world as a Black woman takes a toll physically and physiologically, has consequences. So I'll stop there. And Amanda, you go to the next question.
Thank you. I mean, it's, someone asked it, will there be a recording of the presentation be available after the meeting? Yes, it will be. It is live streaming on Facebook, so the video will be available on Facebook to share. So this is a follow-up question for both of you, and it comes very well from Elizabeth, what you just taught us, and with regard to COVID and how it has affected the challenges for reproductive access for all people. Obviously, there were states that were really taking advantage of COVID in ways to, suppress women's rights in a variety of different ways. But particularly with COVID, we've seen how COVID has affected communities of color so disproportionately because of lack of access to healthcare. And we're going to come back to healthcare later, but particularly with regard to COVID, how has the last year impacted the fight for abortion access and healthcare overall? And then, of course, specifically with regard to women of color, and it doesn't have to be, Elizabeth, that you talk about women of color, and Andy does. I know you both know a lot about, how these issues are manifesting for everyone. So, Andy.
Yeah, so abortion, as always, becomes a political football the minute there's an opportunity. So I'm sure folks heard that a number of states tried to take advantage of the COVID crisis to cut off access completely by claiming it was not essential care. And that, that happened in a few states, and there were a few days in there and had to go to the courts, and there was time in there where there was no access. And the abortion providers said it was just terrible. They'd have to call everybody and cancel all their appointments and then reschedule them and then cancel them again. It was just, people's lives were, they were playing ping pong with them. It was just terrible. But I will say there's a really great quote that I just want to read from Justice Sotomayor, which I happened upon today when I was reading a really fascinating article about her. And it may or may not have heard, but the Supreme Court, in the new 6-3 Supreme Court, 6 meaning 6 conservative justices, already has had a ruling on abortion. So there was a lawsuit on behalf of ACOG, which is the American, Coalition of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. It's the group that represents the obstetricians and gynecologists. ACOG brought a lawsuit to say that medication abortion, which is an extremely safe way to have an abortion, you take a series of pills that essentially induce a miscarriage. It's got a better safety profile than Tylenol and aspirin that you buy in Walgreens every day. And because it's abortion and it's politicized, it's under very strict guidelines from the FDA that are totally medically unnecessary and requires that it be picked up in person. So basically the person who needs the abortion has to go to the office, take it in their hand, and then go home to take the pill. So the lawsuit said that this should be suspended during COVID because it's a health risk to force people to travel. A lower court agreed. It went up to the Supreme Court, and with this new majority, they overturned that and put the in-person requirement back in place. So not a great sign for what we can see coming from our Supreme Court. And I wanted to share what Justice Sotomayor wrote in her dissent on this. Pregnancy itself puts a woman at increased risk for severe consequences from COVID-19. In addition, more than half of women who have abortions are women of color, and COVID-19's mortality rate is 3 times higher for Black and Hispanic individuals than non-Hispanic white individuals. On top of that, 3/4 of abortion patients have low incomes, making them more likely to rely on public transportation to get to a clinic to pick up their medication. Some patients must bear further risk of exposure while they travel, sometimes for several hours each way, to clinics often located far from their homes. So this is both poignantly well done and also pretty incredible that a Supreme Court justice understands the landscape so well and how difficult access is and what these disparities mean. And of course, I think connects back to what Elizabeth was just saying, that forcing a woman of color who's also more likely to experience maternal mortality or morbidity in her pregnancy to remain pregnant, even when she does not want to be, is added to the to the terrible problematic nature of these restrictions and, and the disparate impact they're having. So yes, COVID has had a dramatic impact. I will say briefly on the flip side that it has exposed the reality that medication abortion is extremely safe and can and should be available via telemedicine. We've seen other countries like Great Britain put into place a no test protocol, and everything is now by mail. You get your medication abortion by mail after telehealth with your doctor. So I do think and hope that this moment has at least brought that to light and everybody understands telemedicine in a way they did not a year ago. And the idea of Zooming with your doctor is no longer as crazy as it might have been before. And so I'm hoping that this will be a window, because we're going to see how safe it really is when we start to see, the numbers coming out on these, on this access via telemed. So there could be a silver lining for us, around medication abortion access in the COVID era.
That would require the Supreme Court to care whether it was safe versus whether we as people who can have babies should.
Well, there'd be legislative, like that could happen legislatively. The Supreme Court has spoken and went the wrong way, but now everyone tell the Biden administration, we'll have some action items later, but this is one, is like, we've got to tell the administration that they have got to put a hold on that in-person requirement. It's just absurd.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that I should put it in. I'll put it in the chat while Elizabeth is reflecting on this question. We have a bunch of actions coming up on these issues, and we'll talk more about them later in the program. But I'm going to put a link in the chat for anyone who wants to sign up to be part of your Zioness chapter taking action on reproductive health in the next few weeks. Elizabeth.
Yeah, just to continue on the telemedicine thread, I think, again, one of the things we've seen like in healthcare overall is insurance companies kind of changing their practices around what types of visits they'll cover. So, for example, there are insurance companies that are covering telemedicine mental health visits, that are super important and covering them, to a greater extent than they would have before. So that's just one thing I want to point out, but the others are, not so positive. Again, based on like my interactions with clients and in the advocacy work that I'm doing locally, PPE is a big issue. PPE is something, personal protective equipment, like masks, full face coverings, dressing gowns and gloves, were in short supply at some point, and folks that are actually providing healthcare services on the ground had difficulty accessing them. So in New Mexico in particular, I'm thinking about how, I was on a call with some doulas and midwives in that state that were saying they couldn't provide care to members of their community because they didn't have the personal protective equipment that they needed. They weren't able to isolate after visiting clients from their own families, right, and putting their own families at risk. So they reduced their caseload in many cases, and people were, left to go to the hospitals or go to, access other types of care aside from doulas and midwives, which we know the data has shown are beneficial to folks overall, right, but especially to women of color. The other thing that's happened is, hospitals and birthing facilities restricting the number of guests that people can have, when they're in labor and delivery. And, you can only have maybe one person in the delivery room with you. And that person, is usually a family member or partner. And so doulas, again, birth support personnel like a doula or perinatal health worker are being excluded from the delivery room in many cases. But doulas are important for women of color and, women overall, because they help, care for that person, but also advocate on their behalf in a very vulnerable time, a very vulnerable moment, and help them see their birth plan come to fruition, and also see that they get the quality of care that they deserve, as human beings. So that's something that is a challenge. And I know there are some states that are thinking about what types of legislation they can introduce to ensure that doulas are able to be present in hospitals during labor and delivery. Another thing that's happened is, again, virtual appointments are great if they can be covered, but it changes the nature of care. So, I do wonder, given some of the, again, for doulas and perinatal health workers and midwives who've opted to provide virtual visits, how the nature of that support changes because they can't be there in person with each other. So those are just some of the things that I would point out that are connected to COVID and changing what's happening with folks.
Thank you. Actually, Elizabeth, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about your work with EPOD Day and Black Mamas Matter. I know you're not right now speaking on behalf of Black Mamas Matter, but you're young, you are a trailblazer, you're a real pioneer for reproductive freedom and justice. So tell us a little bit about your work and how people can support it.
Yeah, so, we founded Black Mamas Matter in 2014, it wasn't what it is now, but in 2015, we had the very first gathering of bringing folks together, so stakeholders in Black maternal health, care providers, advocates, lawyers, different people across the spectrum, funders, even philanthropy, they're an important stakeholder in this work. And so we brought those folks together to think about what needed to happen to change the situation for Black mamas in this country. And, I was very fortunate to be part of helping it grow and seeing it become the powerful force that it is today. We spent a lot of time, like I said before, raising awareness, bringing the attention, simply educating folks on the nature of the issue and the scope of the issue. And so it amazes me to see the impact we've had. I'm smiling, laughing because people will, I'll be at brunch with friends, or this was before, this was like in 2019, pre-pandemic life, I'd be out and people would mention, Black maternal health, or here's how, this is what happened during my labor and delivery, or, but people are also very concerned. So I think there's some balance to be had there of informing, but without, making people afraid, right? That they're afraid to give birth now, and that shouldn't be the case, but we do want people to be aware and to get the support and the care that they need. Along those lines, we're also in a moment where we're kind of still waiting and pushing for the system to change. And I wonder if it ever will. These systems were designed in a way that they were, meant to oppress and meant to serve certain people, in particular meant to serve white people of a certain class even, right? So I think there's still a lot of work to be done, but I'm hoping that we're moving from this awareness phase that we were in previously to actually getting people to make the change that's required. I got an email from a reporter the other day asking why some of the data was still the same. And, my answer is twofold: that one, change takes time, but two, given the nature of the problem, which we call out as racism, discrimination, and really unfair treatment of or neglect of, Black mamas, if people aren't changing the way they act, if healthcare systems are not willing to call in and hold providers accountable, because people make up systems, right? That's the point I definitely don't want to forget, is that individuals make up systems. So it's not some nebulous, system that is guilty. It's people functioning in these systems that are able to make a difference. And if there's an unwillingness for them to change or to do anything differently, then we're going to continue to see the same results. So there's a lot of fight, a lot of fight left to be had, a lot of, encouraging people to take meaningful action, to be accountable, and to do the right thing. And so that's what my work is all about. And with EPOD A, I started that because I recognize that people who are doing this work, it's challenging, it's hard. We need safe spaces to be able to do it, to be able to refuel, to re-energize, stand in solidarity and support of each other. So that's the work that I'm doing. And yeah, there's a long road, but I'm in it for the long haul.
So I refuse to accept the possibility that the system can't change. And we have a national grassroots activist base that is ready to take action to make sure it changes and to take the lead of people like you who are just doing such incredible work. I mean, you're founding at least 2 organizations and a consulting firm. And, you know, and there are so many inspiring leaders like you that give us a lot of opportunities to engage. So that I'm going to use as a plug for everyone to please check the form that I pasted in the comments, and please sign up to take action with us. I know we have a lot of passionate activists that want to do that. And that is actually a perfect segue to, you know, what kind of change we want to see. So of course, there's the systemic racism. Addressing, you know, health inequality is going to require us to actually look at the way that racism manifests in our society and, you know, who gets access to what. But in terms of these specific issues, in terms of the specific legislative priorities, you know, things that we could be focusing on that could actually change policy, which of course, again, you know, changing the people that work in the institutions is going to take more time, I think, than changing the policy, which feels more possible, I think, at least, you know, than it did maybe a year ago. So, you know, there are a lot of different issues, policy issues that we should be focusing on. And I guess I'm curious for both of you, and we'll start with Andy. What are the specific issues that are the most important between, you know, the medical abortions, admitting privileges, parental consent, you know, the timeline of when people can have abortion, you know, even under Roe. So, you know, where would you focus your priorities, or is it just we have to tackle all of it, which, you know, the Hyde Amendment, you know, as another one. So there's so much work to do. I love what you call the new package, the Elizabeth.
The momnibus. I'm
Yeah,
going to drop the link.
Are people lobbying for that yet? Yeah. Okay. So that's another thing. Okay, so yeah, so Andy, let's start with you in terms of what you think the priorities are, and how, for activists, how can we move the ball forward?
I mean, I'd say it's also important. I mean, and I think it's, at the end of the day, it's about building political power. So I will start with that, and then I could go into some specific legislation. But, you know, I think, you know, Elizabeth mentioned much earlier the organizing that's happening, and we all saw that in this last election. You know, for the past 50 almost years, I think our country's really thought about at least abortion in particular as a question of rights. And with the Trump Supreme Court and the Trump federal bench of judges, like, that protection is going away. And we can't really count on the courts to save us, but frankly, we never could. And Roe has been chipped away for decades to being almost, you know, unrecognizable for many people. Roe hasn't been a reality for a very long time, particularly people who live in rural places or people who are systemically excluded from healthcare access for all the reasons we've been talking about here tonight, whether they're low income, a person of color, a trans or LGBT, people who don't feel welcome in the healthcare system. So there's the deep, you know, seated reasons why, and, you know, the courts are no longer going to be able to, you know, get us this access. And I was saying, you know, Roe hasn't been good for a long time. And frankly, Roe wasn't great when it was decided. It was not as strong as it should have been. It didn't center the person that needed the abortion. It centered the doctors and the you know, insufficient healthcare system. So there's a lot of change that's needed that goes way beyond codifying Roe, because that's what we're hearing now from this administration. And the response to that is that's not good enough. Roe wasn't good enough, and codifying Roe isn't good enough. We need legislation like the momnibus bill. And Elizabeth put a link in here. And for anyone who signs up on our on the list that Amanda put into the chat, I should say I'm also one of the co-leaders of the Chicago Zioness chapter. I see at least Talia from our Chicago chapter on here, probably others. But there's other opportunities right away. The Hyde Amendment, which was mentioned in that video, which is a terrible policy that just discriminates against people who are low income to take away healthcare coverage for abortion specifically, has been in place almost since Roe. And there's a big effort to get that repealed, led by an amazing group called All Above All. And they're doing a postcard campaign in the next couple weeks around getting Hyde out of the budget. And also about medication abortion access, like I mentioned earlier, about getting those overly restrictive regulations on medication abortion off and following the science instead of the politics. So there's that postcard campaign. I also want to shout out if any other fellow Chicago or Illinois folks are on here. We're going to be mobilizing our chapter because there's a terrible law here in Illinois. Many people think, oh, Illinois, you're all set. But in fact, if you are 17 or under, Illinois requires notification of a parent before you can have an abortion. This is a really harmful law. We know that for most young people, if they have a trusted adult, they will talk to them and go to them. But if their parents or guardians are not trusted adults, forcing them to talk to them can in fact put them in danger. And instead they're forced to go in front of a judge, which is just crazy, to get permission to have their abortion, and basically saying to the judge, like, you know, the judge can say, well, no, we don't think you're competent enough to decide to have an abortion, so therefore you have to become a parent, right? It's just, everything about it makes no sense and just puts young people at risk. Huge effort right now to get that law off the books in Illinois. And we are really excited for everyone who's on here, Illinois or not, to join us in phone banking and reaching out and getting people to understand what this law is and why it's so harmful. So there's a lot that can be done right now. And in whatever state you're in, you should look into who the abortion fund is, what they're doing to ensure access, and who else is, you know, leading efforts around access to healthcare in your state, because there's a lot of work to do. And again, it's going to be about these elections and building power and voting on these issues and making it clear that that's what we're voting on, because that's how we're going to get them to listen.
Elizabeth?
Thank you. I dropped the link because I think the Black Maternal Mom of this is just such a powerful example of what kind of legislation is possible when community is involved. So that that suite of bills is a result of a number of Black women and women of color led organizations coming together and just putting their thinking caps on about what is the comprehensive approach to changing the world, you know, changing what we're seeing happen. And, you know, there are any number of, you know, pieces of legislation that are moving in different states. And I appreciate, you know, Andy calling some of them out. But, you know, I would offer this instead or in addition, and that is to invest in those community-based organizations that are doing local advocacy, that are doing local service provision, that are doing the organizing, that need the resources to get it all done. I'm a very big proponent of, you know, these mottos and slogans of, you know, invest in Black women, trust Black women to get the work done. We saw it happen in Georgia. You know, we can see it happen in other states. But they need resources and they need support. And when we have the right resources, you know, anything is possible. So, you know, I would call on folks that are listening, you know, if you have the resources, if you know people with them, to find ways to give the folks, to the folks that are in the Black Mamas Matter Alliance, to give to the abortion funds, to give to any of the organizations that that you see that are doing really solid work. And, you know, with your support, they can ensure that we don't continue on this path that Andy so eloquently, you know, laid out, that we see a reversal, a turn, you know, a change in politics and in what's happening. So I just wanted to put that out there.
So in our follow-up email, which we'll send tomorrow, we can send a few links to organizations that Elizabeth thinks are really important for us to invest in, and would love for people to do that. I know I'm really excited to support the Black Mamas Matter Alliance and to keep following everything that you're doing, Elizabeth. And I have a couple more questions that I think are really important. One I know is close to all of us watching and all of us on the panel as well. There is a relationship that not a lot of people know about between the anti-choice movement and white supremacy. And it became very apparent for a lot of people on January 6th, when the faces of some of the people who were storming the Capitol were really recognizable to people who are active, in the abortion access movement and in reproductive health and justice more generally. So, given, the intersection of racism and anti-Semitism and patriarchy and white supremacy, this is a really important issue for, if you want to confront white supremacy, making sure that women have abortion access, have reproductive freedom is something that you should really be focused on. And I would love, Andy, if you want to just reflect on that.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think you said it, the folks in the abortion community recognize those faces, and there were a lot of good articles about that have come out recently. I'm going to post one in the chat. Renee Bracy Sherman, who's a leading activist in the reproductive justice space and is a founder of an organization called We Testify. It's an abortion storytelling organization. And she wrote a very powerful piece about this. I hope I'm putting it in right. There we go. And Blavity. And she just says it far better than I ever could about reminding us that the history of folks who want to take away abortion access is one that is in white supremacy and racism, starting with, at some point in this, the decision basically when it was no longer palatable to push for segregated schools and they needed a new political wedge issue, they turned to abortion. So that kind of tells you all you need to know about who is really behind this, right? And there's a lot of work that the movement needs to do. And I, a leader in the reproductive rights and health space and who identifies as white myself, like recognizing that I and my colleagues and all of us have a lot of work to do to figure out how we can undo some of these systems. And as Elizabeth said, support and follow the Black women and Black people who are leading in some of these really comprehensive solutions. But yes, I think it's very important to understand that these efforts are one and the same. The people who are being denied their rights, denied the right to vote, are the same people being denied the right to access abortion and denied healthcare through Medicaid expansion. The list goes on. And it's all part and parcel, as Elizabeth said, of systems that were designed to work this way. So the filibuster is functioning how it's supposed to by taking away power, right? The way the Senate is structured is sort of working just how it's supposed to take away power. So we have some real structural problems in this country that, if they're not solved, I think are leading us on a dangerous course. And I think the last 4 years have made that more clear than ever, that it can't keep going as it has. So, absolutely, I think we are all in this, we all need to be in this fight together because the threats are really real. So,
and really shared. So, and that's, something that is
for sure. And as Renee mentions in this article that I hope everyone will take the time to read and check out Renee's work, anti-Semitism too is right in there, right? So not that needs to be for us to care, but it's important to note, right, that as people who care about, the Jewish people too, right? We know we have a long history. We've been there before, and it wouldn't take a lot for us to be there again. We all get that.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Of course, it doesn't need to be about us for us to care, but it is about us, and we should be aware of that. It's about all of us. This is a collective fight. So I guess to close, I want to try to close on a positive note. And I love that Elizabeth started with a positive note, and then we kind of took her down from her perch. But, it's fascinating. And the video with Padma Lakshmi spoke about it a little bit. Most Americans actually support abortion. So it's fascinating given that abortion is so weaponized and so politicized. And, Lindsey started us with this, recognizing that your politics and your religious observance shouldn't dictate whether you support a woman's right to make choices or a female identifying person's right to make choices about how to protect their own bodily integrity. And this is the thing that actually the majority of people believe. So how do we move past the partisanship on this issue? Can we? Is it possible? Obviously, we're in a terribly complex political moment, but how do we continue leveraging the support that actually exists in among the American people for abortion and move forward from there? And then a little caveat to that, specifically for Andy, is for the many men. I actually love seeing how many men are watching on the Zoom, and I'm sure there are a lot of men also watching on Facebook. How can men be active, when they often don't know whether they have a role in this kind of movement?
I think I would just say briefly that I think part of this is culture change. And so, that video talked about stigma. And so want to, ask people to really ask themselves, how they're contributing to culture change, what that means, whether it's anti-racism culture change of being willing to be the person in the room that calls out when someone says something and not leaving that to the, to the person of color who might be in a, not be in the same position to speak out, and like really stepping up as an ally and what that means. But also, an anti-abortion stigma, right? Like how many times have you heard yourself say or heard someone say, I support abortion, but I would never have one myself? Or I can understand someone needing an abortion once, but shouldn't they know better after that? Or, well, it's one thing early in pregnancy, but then, shouldn't they have, made a decision? Like things that I hear people who would say, I'm really pro-choice, but all the time, and ask yourself, what kind of stigma you are perpetuating there, right? I say this to this group because I presume that most people who've tuned in here are, would consider themselves supporters and might have heard themselves in some of those statements. So learning a bit more, talking with people, and also, calling out statements like that and questioning your own biases and having conversations about this with your friends, with your family, just bringing it up and recognizing that, 1 in 4 people in this country, 1 in 4 women is actually the stat, will have an abortion. So this is really common. It's really normal. And the more we keep it, talk about it as controversial, when in fact it's really not, right? It is only controversial in the sense that there's a political fight over it. But in terms of whether or not people think this should be available and accessible, that people should, whether or not we should be stigmatized, that whether the choice should be made by you or by the government, it's not controversial at all because the vast majority of people are very clear on it. And so I think we've allowed this narrative to continue to take hold around it being controversial, when in fact, that is, part of the rights tactic and strategy. And if we stepped back, most people recognize that life is complicated, and deciding whether or not to become a parent is a really complicated and important decision that nobody should be making for anybody else. And that's pretty straightforward to most people.
And men who want to get involved.
Sorry, yes, we have to give a shout out to Men for Choice, a wonderful organization that we know and love here at Zioness. And men who want to get involved, you should definitely check out Men for Choice, as they are doing a lot to engage men. And just to say that, right, that people, as we've been talking about, supporting others because it's the right thing to do, and we're all part of it, right? We all know that misogyny and patriarchy are alive and well in our country, and we are not going to dismantle that without some men being willing to step up and own that too. And so we need good male allies who are willing to follow the lead of the people leading in these efforts and add their voices and show that it matters, because it does.
And Men for Choice, it's at men4choice.org, and they have a toolkit for men to engage men. It's men working with men. They have women leading it as well, but I think it's an amazing opportunity for men who don't necessarily know where they fit in, but want to be allies to do this work. And this is a numbers game, right? Like legislation changes when more people support it. So for people who aren't sure whether they have a role in this, you do. Find an opportunity to get involved. And if you sign up on our forum, we'll be in touch with you and we'll find ways to get you involved anyway. But Elizabeth, and your very happy, beautiful, bright red smile finishes us on something cheerful.
Yeah, I was just gonna ditto, what Andy said. I think culture shift is what is gonna help us move forward, and culture change does not happen without really challenging and difficult conversations. So I encourage, everyone to lean into what might feel awkward, what might feel difficult, to make it normal, to normalize the conversation, for people when brunch is a thing again, for us to be talking about abortion as well as Black maternal health, as well as all the other things that we're dealing with and processing in life over brunch. I wanted to see that kind of a world, and that's where all the change is going to come from. Us being really open and honest with each other, calling each other in, calling each other out, and just being willing to share, and to step up and make sure that we're creating the future that we want to see for the people that are going to come after us, right? So it's not, we're not just doing this for ourselves, we're also doing this for a liberated future. So people are holding that in mind. Hopefully that inspires them.
Thank you. That was amazing. You're all incredible. I just put it on the screen so we can see everyone. And I just want to say thank you each for your really remarkable contribution to this conversation. And for people who are watching, please again sign up. I will actually post this on the Facebook, but right, I just realized that it wasn't available on the Facebook, so I'm going to post it right now. And it's Zioness, for anyone who doesn't know, is a domestic social justice activist organization for American Jews and our allies who want to be engaged in the advancement of the progressive movement. Social, racial, economic, gender, and environmental justice are our main focuses. And this is a place where you can show up with your full authentic self and do the work that matters so much for the future of our country, and for all the things that we care about in terms of everything that we want to see, all the change that we want to make, and you can do it with us, and feel really proud of your full Jewish Zionist self in that process. So I'm just going to post this right now. If you're watching on Facebook, don't go anywhere. And again, a really super special thank you to all of these really incredible panelists. And again, we will follow up for everyone who registered with an email with organizations you can support, ways to sign up and take action with Zioness. And if you are not registered and you're watching another way, please make sure to email me at amanda@zioness.org, and I'll make sure that you are on our list to get action alerts for the future. So that's it. Thank you so much. And I just posted on Facebook for anyone watching. So that's it. Have a great night, everyone. And happy Black History Month also. we didn't even say it. It's a super important time to recognize the incredible contribution of Black Americans, and to remember that we have made extraordinary progress in this country, but we are not done. There is a lot of work to do. And so having you, Elizabeth, and people like you who are leading in these fights and giving us really admirable, inspiring people to follow, we're grateful for that. Okay, ending it now. Bye, guys.